Aristotle, in 90 minutes. Introduction. Aristotle was perhaps the first and the greatest of all polymaths. He is known to have written on everything from the shape of seashells to sterility, from speculations on the nature of the soul to meteorology, poetry, and art, and even the interpretation of dreams. He is said to have transformed every field of knowledge that he touched, apart from mathematics, where Plato and Platonic thought remained supreme. Above all, Aristotle is credited with the founding of logic. When Aristotle first divided human knowledge into separate categories, this enabled our understanding of the world to develop in a systematic fashion. But in recent centuries, our knowledge expanded to the point where it was being seriously hindered by this categorization. Such systems of thought allowed knowledge to develop only along certain predetermined paths, many of which were in danger of petering out. A radically different approach was needed. The result is the modern world of science. The fact that it took us over 20 centuries to discover these limitations in Aristotle's thought only demonstrates his unparalleled originality. Yet even the demise of Aristotelian thought has given rise to many fascinating philosophical questions. How many more of these limitations have we yet to discover? How dangerous are these flaws in our way of thinking? And exactly what are they preventing us from learning? Aristotle's life and works. On a promontory above the village of Stagira in northern Greece stands a rather uninspired modern statue of Aristotle. Its expressionless face gazes out over the lumpy, wooded hills toward the distant blue Aegean. Aristotle's pristine white marble form, almost luminescent in the brilliant sunlight, wears a décolleté toga and sandals, bearing a slightly chipped scroll in its left hand. This damage is said to be the work of a souvenir-hunting Argentinian philosophy professor. Carved into the plinth, in Greek, are the words, Aristotle the Stagirite. Aristotle was born in Stagira, but despite the statue, he wasn't born in the modern village of Stagira. According to the guidebook, he was born in nearby ancient Stagira, whose ruins are still visible. After my disappointing encounter with the statue, I set off to find the ruins. These were somewhere just down the road, I was told, by a young batman returning home from school. With a flourish of his black plastic cloak, he indicated the road to the coast. After an hour's sweltering walk down the long, winding road, with the thunder rumbling ominously around the rocky hills above me, I was eventually given a lift to Stratoni, an eerie combination of deserted seaside resort and mining village. Ancient Stagira lay somewhere off the old road a bit farther to the north, I was told, by a carpenter who was repairing the closed cafe on the empty waterfront. Few cars travel on this road in October, as I was soon to discover, and the autumn storms in this region, when they eventually break, can be severe. For an hour I sheltered beneath a narrow ledge of rock as the torrential downpour cascaded over the bare hillside, with no sign of ruins or vehicles visible in the flickering, crashing gloom around me. Soaked to the skin, I raged to myself about the statue of Aristotle which had led me to Stagira, the wrong Stagira. It was nothing more than a fraud. The modern village of Stagira had no claim whatsoever to be known as Aristotle's birthplace, apart from fortuitously sharing the same name. Why, by the same token, they might just as well erect a statue of Joan of Arc in New Orleans. Aristotle was born in 384 BC at ancient Stagira in Greek Macedonia. In the 4th century BC, Macedonia was regarded by the ancient Greeks in much the same way as the modern French regard Britain and America. But Stagira was not beyond the pale of civilization. This was a small Greek colony founded by the Aegean island of Andros. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, had been personal physician to Amyntas, the king of Macedon, and grandfather of Alexander the Great. As a result of this connection, which had ripened into friendship, Aristotle's father seems to have become a rich man, acquiring estates around Stagira and elsewhere in Greece. The young Aristotle was brought up in an atmosphere of medical learning, but his father died when he was still young. Aristotle was then taken to Athens, a Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, where he was brought up by his cousin Proxenus. Like many an heir to a fortune, Aristotle soon began spending his inherited cash in determined fashion. According to one story, he blew the lot on wine, women, and song, and ended up so broke that he was forced to join the army for a spell. After this, he returned to Stagira, where he took up medicine. Then, at the age of 30, he gave it all up and set off for Athens to study at the academy under Plato, where he remained for 8 years. Later medieval hagiographers, determined to turn Aristotle into a saintly character, tended to ignore or discount these unthinkable calumnies. And sure enough, there is another version of Aristotle's early manhood. According to this rather more boring, but admittedly rather more credible story, Aristotle went straight to the academy at the age of 17. Yet even some of the sources for this story allude to a brief playboy interlude. Either way, Aristotle soon settled down to a period of intense study at the academy, quickly establishing himself as the finest mind of his generation. Initially, he was a student, but he was soon invited to become one of Plato's colleagues. It seems that, to begin with, Aristotle worshipped Plato. He certainly absorbed all the Platonic doctrine that was taught at the academy, and his own philosophy was to be firmly grounded in its principles. But Aristotle was far too bright to be a mere follower of anyone, even Plato. When Aristotle discerned what appeared to be a contradiction, or, heaven forbid, a flaw in the works of his master, he felt it his intellectual duty to point this out. This habit soon began to irritate Plato, and though they appear not to have quarrelled, the evidence suggests that the two greatest minds of their age soon found it politic to maintain a certain distance. Plato is known to have referred to Aristotle as the mind on legs, and to have called his house the reading shop. This latter remark referred to Aristotle's famous collection of ancient scrolls. Aristotle was in the habit of buying up as many rare scrolls of ancient works as he could lay his hands on, and was one of the first private citizens to own a library. The young academic evidently received a considerable income from his inherited estates, and soon became known in Athens for his cultured manners and gracious, if rather scholarly, lifestyle. Tradition has it that he was a weedy fellow, with spindly legs, who spoke with a lisp. Perhaps to compensate for this, he became a natty dresser, donning the latest fashion in sandals and togas, and adorning his fingers with tastefully jewelled rings. Even Plato, who was no pauper, envied Aristotle his library. Yet, despite Aristotle's comfortable and refined way of life, his early works, now lost, were mainly dialogues, discussing the base futility of existence and the joys of the hereafter. Aristotle had a natural inclination toward the practical and the scientific. This led him to view Plato's ideas from an increasingly realistic standpoint. Plato believed that the particular world we perceive around us consists of mere appearances. The ultimate reality lies in a further world of ideas, which resemble forms or ideals. The particular objects of the world we perceive derive their reality only by partaking in this ultimate world of ideas. Thus, a particular cat, such as the black one I can see lying on the chair, is only a cat because it partakes in the ultimate idea, or form, of cattiness, and it is only black in so far as it partakes in the idea, or ideal, of black. The only true reality lies beyond the world we perceive, in this ultimate realm of ideas. Where Plato's approach to the world was essentially religious, Aristotle's tended toward the scientific. This made him disinclined to dismiss the world around us as unreal, but he did continue to divide things into primary and secondary substances. Except that for Aristotle the primary substances were the particular objects of the world, and the secondary substances were the ideas or forms. Initially he dithered about which of these substances was in fact the ultimate reality, partly out of respect for Plato. His old teacher had, after all, suggested this conception in the first place. But gradually Aristotle became more and more convinced that he was living in the real world, and he shifted away from Plato's view. Over the years, how dangerous are these flaws in our way of thinking, and exactly what are they preventing us from learning? Aristotle's life and works. On a promontory above the village of Stagira in northern Greece stands a rather uninspired modern statue of Aristotle, understanding of the world to develop in a systematic fashion. But in recent centuries, our knowledge expanded to the point where it was being seriously hindered by this categorization. Such systems of thought allowed knowledge to develop only along certain predetermined paths, many of which were in danger of petering out. A radically different approach was needed. The result is the modern world of science. The fact that it took us over 20 centuries to discover these limitations in Aristotle's thought only demonstrates his unparalleled originality. Yet even the demise of Aristotelian thought has given rise to many fascinating philosophical questions. How many more of these limitations have we yet to discover? The interpretation of dreams. He is said to have transformed every field of knowledge that he touched, apart from mathematics, where Plato and Platonic thought remained supreme. Above all, Aristotle is credited with the founding of logic. When Aristotle first divided human knowledge into separate categories, this enabled our Aristotle in 90 minutes. Introduction. Aristotle was perhaps the first and the greatest of all polymaths. He is known to have written on everything from the shape of seashells to sterility, from speculations on the nature of the soul to meteorology, poetry, and art, and even